investment banking.
Hi, and welcome to the latest edition of Inc.'s Idea Lab. I'm Kevin Ryan, Associate Editor at Inc.com, and I'm joined today by Jake Knapp, Design Partner at GV, formerly Google Ventures, and author of Sprint, How to Solve Big Problems and Test New Ideas in Just 5 Days. Jake, thanks a lot for being here.
No, thanks for having me.
So you created the prototype for what eventually became Google Hangouts. Can you tell me how that inspired you to create what you call the design sprint?
Kind of by accident. So I was visiting a couple of engineers who work in the Google Stockholm office. And we had been talking about this idea for how, what is now Google Hangouts might work, this video conference software. I was only visiting for 3 days, and so we cleared our calendars and we kind of holed ourselves up in a room with no windows, and we just tried to solve the problem together. And because of that time constraint, and because we were all in the same room focused on the same thing, we moved so much faster than I normally did my normal day-to-day work. We created a prototype that was ready to use by the end of the 3-day visit. And when I looked back and reflected on that time, I realized that was kind of amazing, that deadline and that teamwork that happened. I've got to find a way to reproduce that. And that was one of the sparks that led to the sprint process.
Can you tell us a little bit about Google Ventures, or GV? I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it, but don't know exactly what it is.
Yeah, GV is an investment fund. So we're a venture fund, and we've invested in over 300 startups. And there's some that you probably have heard of, like Slack and Uber and Nest. And of course, there's many new ones that are small, just a couple people that are starting out, but we're focused on life science, consumer products, and really trying to find companies that we think are going to be successful and do everything we can to make them as successful as possible. One of the interesting things about GV is that we made a big bet on design. So Bill Maris, who started GV back in 2009, hired my colleague and co-author, Braden, back in 2009, and he was the first design partner at any venture fund. And the bet was that design could help companies be successful. If we could find a way to use it, we thought we could actually speed up how companies tested ideas and help them be more in touch with their customers and find solutions that matched. The sprint is a big part of that philosophy, and it's really only through this opportunity to work with all these different companies really fast in their very early stages that we've been able to kind of battle test it and find the formula that works so well.
What advantages would a startup have over a larger company when going through a design sprint?
Well, I think with a startup, and this is not always true, but usually it's more clear what you're focused on, and you have a greater sense of urgency often, because if you don't come up with a solution that your customers love, in time, your startup will go out of business. And often large companies don't have that pressure quite as intensely as a startup does. It's also, if you have a small team, it's easier to decide which 5 to 7 people should be in the sprint. And so when you have that sense of focus at a company level, and when you're a small team, it can be a little easier to do a sprint. But the reality is that sprints work and have worked, and we've heard many stories of sprints working at large companies. In fact, I started doing the process at Google, where there are very big teams and certainly well-funded, complex products. So it can work in both environments.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about the principle of renting before you buy as it applies to design.
Yeah.
How does that apply to the design process?
Well, what can happen too often in the regular way of building products and services is that you have a hunch, an idea about what's going to be a great solution, a great product. And you might spend months or sometimes even years building that thing and getting it out into the real world without knowing for sure how people will react. And people's reactions are very hard to predict. And I found that no matter how many repetitions of sprints I do, I have gotten no better at predicting how people will react. But I am sure that when you do a sprint, you can find out much, much faster. So in a sprint, in just 5 days, everybody clears their calendar, they build a realistic prototype, and by Friday, you're testing something with your real customers. You've got 5 customers who come in one at a time. They see the prototype, they react. In that scenario, you've fast forwarded into the future and found out what will happen if you build that thing. And then you can decide whether to commit, whether to tweak your course, or sometimes even whether to abandon it altogether.
Can you take us through what a design sprint actually is? Quickly, Monday through Friday, it's a 5-day process, and what goes on?
Yeah, absolutely. So before the sprint, there's some important things that happen. You've got to have the right team. We want a diverse set of skills. We want about 7 people in the room. You also want the decision maker. So we call that person the decider. We want them in the room as well. Now, if it's a small company, it's obvious that's the CEO. Sometimes you have to find the right person, but you've got to get them involved. On Monday, the job is to make a map of the problem, the service, how all the pieces fit together, and list out the customers. Once the team has done that, they can pick a target and make sure that they're focused on the right spot. This is in sharp contrast to the way information is normally shared on teams, which is a little bit haphazard. We often share information in a meeting, this week and a meeting next week, but we don't all sit down and get everything on the table before we try to solve the problem. So that's what happens Monday. Tuesday is when you start coming up with solutions, and rather than doing a sort of shout out loud group brainstorm, we work individually and quietly, and this allows every person on the team to come up with their own opinionated solution. So by the end of the day on Tuesday, you've got these competing ideas, and then on Wednesday you have to choose. You have to figure out which of these are the best, which ones do we want to test. So we do some structured decision making. Again, we're trying to avoid a situation where people are having an abstract debate and going back and forth and on and on and on. We structure the critique of those ideas. The ideas are anonymous when they're put up on the wall, so you're not making decisions based on whether you think someone's smart or whether they make a good
or
sales
they're
pitch.
Your boss.
Yeah, or they're your boss. Yeah, which is an important thing to avoid, even though we want that decision maker in the room. And then ultimately, the decision maker does make the call, but it's after they've been informed by the whole team. And then Thursday, you build a prototype. So we want something that looks realistic, and when a customer sees it, they'll react to it rather than seeing something that's kind of half-baked and they sort of get into feedback mode. They think they're sort of participating with you. We really want people to show us the way they would respond in the real world if this thing was finished and built. And it might seem crazy to build a prototype in such a short period of time, but because you know for sure you're focused on the right thing after Monday, and because you've got so much detail in the solutions, and that happens on Tuesday, you don't worry about whether you're doing the right thing. You don't have to ask a lot of questions. You're just executing and building something. And then on Friday, we test it. So we take that facade and we show it to 5 customers. One at a time, we bring in customers, we show them the prototype, sometimes multiple prototypes that are kind of competing head to head. So by the end of the day on Friday, by the end of that week, you've seen patterns. You know which ideas work, which ones need some more work before they're ready, and which ones to abandon. And the team has clarity about what to do starting next Monday.
Mm-hmm. What types of companies have you worked with? Specifically companies, or what industries have they been in?
Being a VC in Silicon Valley, we've worked with companies making iPod and iPhone and web apps, companies like Medium and Slack. But we've also worked with a lot of healthcare companies, so Foundation Medicine, Flatiron Health, a lot of companies who are trying to make tools for the sorts of expert users that you might think this kind of process, and we actually at first thought this process wouldn't work for because it moves so fast, it seems like it wouldn't allow for that kind of nuance. It turns out when you get the experts in the room from the team, you can solve those kinds of problems, and when you bring in the right kinds of customers on Friday, you can get the right kind of data. And we've even run sprints with hardware companies. So an example that we talk about in the book is Savioke Labs, who is a robotics company. They make a hotel delivery robot. And in that sprint, they had to build a prototype of how the robot would behave, its sort of personality, and test that on Friday. And as you can imagine, that's complicated, but as you also might imagine, on a team that builds robots, they have the skills to build that kind of prototype.
So why put your team under the pressure of a 5-day deadline?
I think that there is some magic in a deadline, and it's that same thing I noticed in that 3-day session that I had many years ago in Stockholm. But what happens with the deadline when you know that customers are coming in on Friday is that you're willing to focus, you're willing to make tough decisions and end conversations that become unproductive. And when you get to Thursday and you're building that prototype, you are galvanized. You'll get something done quickly because you don't want to be embarrassed on Friday morning that you don't have something ready. The other thing, though, that's amazing about that time constraint is that you're not going to fall in love with your ideas. If you work on something, even for 2 weeks, we often find that, like I myself will fall into this trap of starting to believe just on faith that my idea is the right one. And it becomes harder to let go if you find out that something about it or even the whole idea isn't right. So we partly want that deadline just to force that kind of unattached, almost emotionless reaction when you're evaluating which ideas were good and which weren't on Friday.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you compare the people who should be involved in the sprint to characters from Ocean's 11.
Yeah.
Why the analogy, and who are those people who should be involved?
Well, like many people, I watched Ocean's 11, and when I did, I was like, man, that's so cool. And it wasn't just cool because it has like Brad Pitt and George Clooney in it, although that's part of why it's so cool, but it was cool because everybody was doing their skill. They had their thing, and it was part of this sort of cohesive, intricate plan, and they were doing their best work. In the first days of starting on this path of trying to make my own work better, I wanted to make my time at work feel like it matched my ideals for work. I wanted to go home satisfied, like I'd done a job well done. And on many days, it wasn't like that. It was fragmented by meetings and things. And so in the sprint, you get the opportunity with the time pressure, with your team, working together to use the best of your skills, to apply it to the most important thing, not the 10 most important things, and to really know your teammates better and see what they're good at. And that combination it's kind of a better team building event than any sort of bowling offsite or other kind of activity you might do. And all of those things are kind of lead me to think that maybe if you run a sprint, you kind of are living Ocean's 11 in your own way.
Mm-hmm. So why is 7 the correct number of people to use?
Well, I really learned this the hard way with a lot of trial and error. In my first sprint that I ran at Google back in 2010, I actually had 40 people in the room the first day, and that's clearly way too many. But as you can imagine, the more people in the room, often the longer discussions will go. So we quickly learned that the number needed to be smaller. And we also learned that on the low end, if you have too few people, you don't have enough of that diversity. You don't have that Ocean's 11 factor of, oh good, we've got the pickpocket, we've got the acrobat, we can do the different things we need to do to make the prototype work. As long as you had 4 or 5 people, you definitely have all of the skills, all of the information you needed. But if you got more than 7, things would start to slow down, and you'd spend a lot of more time making sure everyone, we reviewed everyone's solutions. So it turns out 7 is the sweet spot. After running all these sprints, actually after writing the book, I learned that there is some research that backs this up, but if only I had read that, 5 years ago.
Now, you have interesting opinions about brainstorming. So you have these 7 people in a room. The method is not what you would call classic brainstorming. What do you think about brainstorming, and what is the process you use instead?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of data that supports the idea that brainstorming is not as effective as individual work. But I myself used to think that, well, that data doesn't account for good brainstorming, and if we do it in the right way, it'll be better. I think brainstorming is very appealing. It has a great ring to it. Brainstorming sounds really active and exciting, and brainstorming in a group is fun. But what I learned over the course of, many years ago, I tried running group brainstorms, and I ran dozens of them. I learned that the solutions we came up with in the brainstorm, no matter how I tweaked the process, and I'm a real process nerd, I tried all kinds of things, but those solutions were not as strong as the ones that people came up with when they were going for a walk or waiting in line or in the shower. Whatever they were doing on their own quietly came up with a better solution. So part of the idea in the sprint is to replicate those moments when you have the information you need, you know the problem you need to solve, and you've got the quiet time to solve it. So we allow individuals some structure to make those steps natural. You don't have to think about how to do it, but you're not competing with other people. And people who are in the sprint who are introverted, who aren't as loud and don't like to pitch and sell their ideas, it's a really effective way to make sure that all of the best ideas come out and that they're well thought through by the time we evaluate them.
Tell me about the part of the process, I believe it takes place on day 3 of the sprint, where everybody has their ideas laid out and everyone is choosing their favorite ideas and the aspects of ideas that they like the best.
Yeah, so there's this thing that happens when you're doing a discussion about ideas that often involves either an endless debate, a lot of back and forth discussion, or a sales pitch. And especially some people are really good at this, and they'll be able to explain their idea and make it sound really good. Or as you mentioned, they're your boss, and so when they say their idea is good, you're like, all right, I guess your idea is good. But what we do in the sprint is to try to kind of deconstruct the best parts of a critique of ideas and get rid of the things that take a lot of time and sometimes sabotage good results. You put up the sketches and they're anonymous. There's no names on them. So as we look at them, we don't know who did what sketch. Unless you're sort of a handwriting analyst, maybe you'd be able to crack the code. But in general, it's actually quite hard to tell. And when we look at the sketches, we're making a heat map and kind of with some little stickers and calling out ideas that people think are compelling, writing down notes about ideas that we have criticisms of or questions about. But we're doing all this quietly, so everybody gets to form their own individual opinion about all of these solutions. When we finally discuss them, we've done a lot of the things that normally happen quite slowly out loud. We've done them already with sort of stickers and paper and our quiet evaluation. It's actually then quite easy to go through and quickly critique each idea and say, here's the good parts, let's make sure we make note of the good things in this sketch. Here are the questions, the criticisms, the things that we're not so sure about. And then at the very end, we allow the creator of the sketch to tell us what we missed. By structuring it that way and framing the creator's feedback as tell us what we missed, don't sell it to us, it happens a lot more quickly. And it turns out you get right to the heart of what's good or not so interesting about each solution. So we cut out a lot of the need for debate. And then in the end, we leave it to the decision maker, the decider, to make the call. They pick unilaterally, they make the choice of which 1, 2, or 3 ideas we're going to prototype and test on Friday.
Now, how does the next day of the process work, where you have chosen which prototype or prototypes you're going to go with, and now you have to actually build it? How is that done in only a day?
Yeah, this is like the Ocean's 11 moment when when they're doing the heist and it's all coming together. This might sound like a super stressful day, but in practice it turns out to be really fun because you come to work on Thursday of your sprint and you know exactly what needs to happen. You've got these detailed sketches, you've carefully selected this one as the one that you're going to build in your prototype, and all you have to do on that day is turn that sketch into a testable facade of a finished product. And that might mean that you're practicing your acting because this is something that's going to be tested in a store. And it might mean that you're in PowerPoint or Keynote making a mock-up of what's going to look like an iPhone app. But it can take all kinds of shapes, but it's this really fun, clear day with one purpose and a deadline, and you've got enough time to get it done. And you also know that your whole team is doing this sort of in parallel, so you guys all work together to do different pieces of it. And that day is, for me, the best kind of work day, and it's sort of artificially produced in a sprint, but you get to have it, every time you do a sprint week, you get one of those.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about day 5? That's where we're actually testing the prototype. How does that work? You bring in the 5 customers, and what happens from there?
Day 5 is the day of exaltation and heartbreak. You never know what's going to happen on day 5, and it doesn't matter how many sprints that I'm a part of, I can never predict which solutions are going to work. What we do is to bring in 5 customers who we've carefully chosen to be the target customer for this particular company. And we bring them in one at a time for these 5 one-on-one interviews. In one room, there's the customer and there's one person from the team, just like you and I are kind of sitting next to each other. We give the customer the prototype, and then for the most part, we're just watching how they react as they use it. Again, we want it to look as realistic as possible so that their reactions will be authentic. In another room, the rest of the team is watching over video. So we just use something simple like you can use GoToMeeting or sort of any video conference software. And you can imagine like a laptop with a webcam, you're just streaming the video pretty simply with no expensive setup. The team's watching and taking notes, and as each customer goes through the prototype, reacts, we're seeing what goes well, what doesn't go well. And by the end of the day, we've got patterns. And it turns out 5 people are enough to see the biggest patterns of success and failure for your ideas. So you'll end up knowing by the end of the day which of those ideas were sort of counterfeit $100 bills, and which of them were the real thing.
You mentioned in the book you worked with a coffee company who was redesigning their shop online. And one of the ideas was to create a shop that looks like a physical coffee shop.
Yeah.
And it seems like a great idea. I thought it was a good idea, and the customers did not like it. What did that teach you about the research process and about customers in general?
Well, this is, I'm going to reveal my identity as the creator of that idea, and this was a particularly disappointing one for me because this is a coffee shop. I tried to not get attached to my own ideas in the sprint, but I really wanted to be the one who had come up with this great idea. And we all thought it was so great. Like if you've ever been in a Blue Bottle coffee shop, they have this really nice interior design, and it's quite beautiful. And we thought, boy, that'll be such a unique looking website if it looks physically like the store. It turns out that people thought that looked really cheesy and phony, and we had actually made a really realistic looking prototype of it. It wasn't because the prototype wasn't quite good enough. It was really that the idea was wrong. And that was such a stark illustration of the hunch that turns out to be wrong, the hunch that you would have followed. If you hadn't gotten that quick data, it would have been the kind of thing you'd quite quickly get attached to, commit to building, and probably spend months getting right before you launched it. On the other hand, the ideas that succeeded were one of our competing prototypes had a lot of text, the kind of thing that people never think anyone's going to read on the web. Turns out people, even if they didn't read it all, it gave them a lot of confidence in the coffee's quality. And those kinds of expectations are easy to fall into. We all sort of develop good spidey senses about what's going to work well or not work well in our business. And a lot of times those spidey senses turn out to be wrong or just a little bit off. So you should test early.
Mm-hmm. Why does this process allow a company, a startup especially, who might have limited resources to take more risks than they would normally when creating a product or performing research?
Well, if you're building a real product, you are going to be investing, weeks, months, sometimes years building it, and generally things take longer to build than we think. We're always a bit optimistic when we're making plans about how long it's going to take to execute on something. And even if you can build something really fast, once it's out in the world, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to really effectively measure how well it's working or why it's working or not working. What happens in the sprint is that you've only got 5 days, and we've talked a lot about how that compresses your time and how you have to move fast, but it also gives you a lot of freedom, because if you totally fall on your face in that week, you've only lost 5 days. You haven't burned up all of that extra time. And you've only, in the very worst case, embarrassed yourself in front of 5 customers, not hundreds or thousands or millions. So the sprint is really freeing in a lot of ways for companies. It lets them take those risky ideas, and it also even allows you to test competing risky ideas. You can put 2 of them head to head and not have to water it down, not have to make the safe bet, but see what happens if we could imagine a future and fast forward to it where we'd done this crazy thing. What would it look like, and how would people react? So when you can do that and only cost yourselves 40 hours, it's pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about a time where the sprint did not have a favorable outcome and what you learned from it?
Yeah, there are many what we would call an efficient failure. Now, this happens from time to time in sprints. There's a time, I won't talk about the identity of the company. They had an idea they were quite excited about. Setting off on building it was a probably a 1 year to 18-month long project. What we learned when we tested the prototype in the sprint was that there was a core part of how this feature worked, how it sort of used a customer's information to help suggest things to them that people were like uninterested in and maybe even a little creeped out by. And so, as you might imagine, if you've spent a week building something and trying to come up with a solution and you test it and it fails, it's a rough day. It doesn't feel good to watch 5 people not like the thing that you just so carefully crafted, especially if it's an idea you came into the sprint really excited about. But a week, 2 weeks later, a month later, when you look back and you start to think about what could have been had you not found out so soon that that was the wrong direction, it's quite powerful. And I think that some of the biggest sprint believers turn out to be the folks who have that really tough day on Friday, because that tough day saves you a lot of long, drawn-out pain over the course of building the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. You have an updated version of the phrase ship early, ship often. That's a pretty common phrase in Silicon Valley, in the startup world. What do you think is more effective than that approach?
Well, it's not necessarily a bad approach, but if you reframe it as learn early and learn often, it gets at the heart of what people are trying to accomplish and doesn't require you to ship. And there's all kinds of dangers with shipping, including the fact that it takes a long time. And also, frequently you ship something, it's not the right feature or product or whatever, you want to bring it back, and there's 5 users or 100 users who are madly in love with it, and they bring out their torches and pitchforks. And so shipping is dangerous, it's costly. So what we try to do with the sprint is do that same sort of circle of come up with an idea, build it, launch it, get data, and then repeat. And that's a common circle that goes with ship early, ship often. We just try to turn it into a shortcut where instead of launching, you're still building something and you're still collecting data, but the size of that circle is just much, much tighter. Mm-hmm. And that gets people to the same place, but it does it in a way that's a much better use of everyone's time.
Can you take us through a time where the design sprint worked out beautifully and maybe going into the last day, you didn't quite know what to expect and it had a very favorable outcome?
Well, we did a sprint with Slack, and we talk about this in the book. So if you're not familiar with Slack, it's sort of a collaboration tool for teams. And they were trying to figure out how to explain the product better to new customers. And they had a couple ideas about how to do it, and it emerged on Wednesday that there was these 2 favorites that were really in strong opposition with each other. One of them was kind of a straightforward, step-by-step, here's how it works explanation. The other was a pretty sophisticated engineering effort to be able to kind of talk to customers and give them sort of a simulated experience of using the software with kind of artificial robots who would talk back and forth with you as if they were your team. And the thinking was, well, that would really illustrate how it works. This other way, it's pretty straightforward. It's kind of maybe doesn't feel as creative, but maybe a good fallback. This is another one of those situations where if you were left to your own devices to choose, this idea of the robots talking to you is really exciting. We found out in the sprint that idea didn't help explain what Slack was. And in contrast, the sort of what felt like kind of the boring way to explain it, just like step by step, like this, here's what this part does, here's what this part does, here's how it works, was extremely effective. People who saw that sort of fake branded product were able to immediately explain what it was. That's kind of a beautiful outcome where you're able to test 2 ideas that are quite different. You're able to take something that's an idea that the team was excited about and find out what would happen if they build it. And ultimately you save time by not building the wrong idea. And you also have this clarity and confidence about which thing you should do.
Speaking about talking robots and all new technology, what sorts of trends in technology are making the design process harder than it was maybe just a few years ago?
Well, I actually think that most of the trends in design are making the process easier, but I'll quickly talk about the things that make it harder, and it's the fact that there is an application for software or for new hardware almost everywhere you look. There's, with our phones and our tablets, we're able to apply technology and data to things that we've typically been just physical or analog experiences. And so that means that you're trying to solve problems for sometimes really complicated, sophisticated, expert tools we expect a lot more of our technology, so the quality that we anticipate a new service is going to have, it's getting higher and higher each year. On the flip side, it is easier than it's ever been to prototype things. So if I want to make something that looks like an iPhone app, I can do that in PowerPoint or Keynote. I don't have to have any programming skills to make that actually work. There's template kits that you can get that will sort of fast forward anything you want to build. There's website tools like Squarespace, and there are design tools like InVision that are really just kind of easy. You easily lay something out. You're able to then experience what looks like a web page, even if you haven't plugged in all of the complicated back end that would make it run. And so in a way, what's happening is that as the complexity of what we can do and what people expect things will be able to do increases, our ability to simulate that is going just as fast, if not even a little bit faster. Don't assume that you can't prototype that thing. No matter how complicated it is, there's probably a way to fake it.
Mm-hmm. How is the design process, or the design sprint process specifically, different for a company that creates products, or a company that is in the services industry, or a company that creates software platforms?
Well, we've talked a lot about what it takes to fake software, and you want to make something that looks on the screen like the software. There's a lot of ways to do that. When you're faking a service, you have to act. You need to perform that service in a new way, 5 times. And so if you imagine a restaurant that wants to have a new way of serving its customers, and you have to come up with a script for how each person is going to behave in this new model. And on Friday, you've got to have everyone do that script and act it out 5 times. So I think that what you basically have to do is think of this as like a prototype mindset. Like you start to think about, how can I simulate an experience that appears to be the finished thing, so that the customer won't be able to tell the difference. This isn't the way we always do things, but they don't have any idea. And once you put that lens on, it's kind of possible to prototype almost anything. Anything can be sort of faked at that surface level 5 times. Mm-hmm. It's harder to do it 100 times, 1,000 times, but for 5 times you can do it.
What are some general trends in design that you see today?
Well, I'm always interested in the trends of process and of learning, and what we get really excited about with the companies in our portfolio who do sprints and who start to work in this way is that they are able to get in closer touch with their customers. They're able to know their customers better. In general, there's a lot of tools that exist today in software that allow us to measure the performance of apps and websites and hardware and all kinds of things, and see by the numbers what's happening. But this advantage that you get, and it's almost an unfair advantage on your competition when you actually talk to customers in this way, is that you learn why things work and don't work. And so what we're often trying to help our teams do, and I probably shouldn't give this away, but is if you get in the habit of talking to your customers, you'll get this whole other side of the data that's often invisible to most companies.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people think of design on the surface as just being the aesthetic and the way something looks, but clearly a lot more goes into it. What are those things that go into design beyond just what you're physically looking at in front of you?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, there's a perception that design is about the surface, and also that it's this creative, magical process that only designers can do. And I think when, sometimes when people walk by that design room in their company, they think like it's like those guys are playing D&D in there or something. It just seems weird. But the reality is that design is just a way of solving problems, and it's very focused on understanding the humans who will use the thing that you make. And so if you break down that dark art of understanding the people and making something that works for them into steps, it becomes something that is not solely the purview of designers. It's something anyone can do. And in the sprint process and in the book, what we've done is sort of dissect the pieces and make it a clear recipe. And in that way, it's a tool that is really accessible to any team, no matter what their background is.
What can design or the design process teach an entrepreneur about leadership?
Well, I think that it was surprising to me to realize how scary it can be to be making those decisions. You've got a company that's, you've got people who are working for you. You've got a limited amount of time to find the right product and make it work in the right way. And what often happens is that those decisions feel really weighty. They're scary to make this call that's going to set your course. What I think those leaders can learn when doing a sprint is that they don't have to put all their eggs in one basket. They can, sort of make a one egg omelet, test it, see how it tastes, and then decide if they want to continue. And there are also a bunch of little pieces in the process that help leaders learn how to get the best ideas out of their team. So how to sort of withdraw the coolest things that every person has in their head, and ways to get the wisdom of your team to inform you on your decisions without giving up that opinionated decision making that makes great leaders so effective. So we think of it as both a way to help leaders make informed decisions, in the context of a sprint, but also outside of a sprint, be more effective in every meeting and every little interaction they have with their team.
What is the future of design?
I hope the future of design is that there is no design because everyone's doing it. I think that the word design often makes people feel like it's not for them. It's not something that they know how to do. And design is really just a way to solve problems. It's a way to keep you focused on your customers. And when everyone starts doing that, I think that we'll hopefully talk about design as this magical special thing less and less, and we'll end up with people spending their time better and making things that matter more to our fellow humans. So that sounds a little grandiose, but I believe we can get there if we don't silo it off.
Why would a venture fund invest in design? Why is design important to them?
It's kind of a secret weapon to teams that do it well. So if you think about the best products, the best services, the things that you use every day, they fit your life probably. They give you some, kind of added dimension to what you can do, to the way you can, move around the city or get your job done or talk to people. And what happens is that those companies, those teams have found a way to match their idea, their vision with the realities of the world and the way humans interact with things. So design is kind of the bridge between that vision and the real life, experience that humans have. So if you can help founders consistently build that bridge, you can help more of your companies that you invest in be successful. For a venture fund, that's good business. We invested in design at GV because our founder, Bill, really thought that was going to be an advantage to the companies in our portfolio. And so far, a few years in, we still believe that that's the case. Even if we give away the process to everyone, we still think that if we can help our teams do it consistently, that they'll end up building their great technologies in a faster and more effective way, and they'll mean more to the customers who end up using it.
This process is sort of like in the comedy world. You have SNL, you have South Park, you have weekly news shows that are grinding things out very quickly on a fast deadline. Is there any parallel between this process and what you see in the comedy world?
Yeah, I suppose there probably is. One of the things we're doing is making sure that ideas aren't too precious. And when you have a regular show that comes out once a week or every night, you can't wait for that perfect idea to come along next week. You've got to commit and execute right away. And there's often diminishing returns to those continued iterations. More often than not, they water down the best ideas. So there's a similarity there. And I think the other thing that's similar is the notion of being opinionated. When people work individually and when you have one decision maker who makes the call, ideas stay pure. They have that sort of individual integrity that doesn't come when a whole group works together and waits until they've got consensus on what the best way to do it is. And you might be surprised to hear, but I have not worked on a comedy show in the past. So I don't know exactly what it's like, but my guess would be that strong sense of opinion that comes from the leader, the decision maker at a show, is a big part of what makes it work. It's not funny unless you have one person who has a great sense of humor and the sense of humor that matches that show, and they make the call. The same is true with any good business. You've got to have your great leader make the call if you're going to have an opinionated vision. Otherwise, you've got something that, again, can get watered down by democracy. So democracy is a great way to run a country, or at least the best way that we've found so far. But it's not a good way to make decisions about what you do at work all the time.
So you've written this great book about design and your design sprint process. Why? Why give away all the secrets to this process?
That's a good question. At its heart, GV is on a mission to, this sounds trite maybe, but to make the world a better place. And that sounds like a joke from Silicon Valley, but we really do want to help companies build products that will matter to people. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't, finding this process that works so well, if we didn't try to share it and help people all over the place be more efficient with their work and get closer to those things that really take a vision and match it to the customer's reality. So I think it's the right thing to do to share it. And what I hope is that, when people who are considering taking funding from GV have read the book, that they'll think, I'd like to do a sprint with those guys. So we'll see if that bears out. But at worst, we're going to share it and make it open and accessible to everyone, because there's no reason to hide it away.
I like that. Jake, it's been great. Thanks so much for being here today, and we look forward to seeing your book on shelf soon.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.